Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here and a proud member. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Joel Kotkin. He's the Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University and also the Executive Director at the Center for Opportunity Urbanism. Last November, Richie Paparinen, Senior Research Associate in the Center for Population Dynamics at Cleveland State University's Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs, came here to discuss his research on Cleveland's demographic patterns. What we learned that day is that Cleveland is excelling in two areas: attracting an influx of highly educated, high-skilled workers, and, perhaps more importantly, keeping them here. According to researchers, policymakers and urban planners alike, this is key to any city's continued growth and vibrancy, all of which is great. But even as we find ourselves in the midst of landmark economic growth downtown and in University Circle, we don't have to go very far to see nearby neighborhoods that aren't feeling any of that economic growth, or perhaps feeling very little, or perhaps just not yet. Grappling with those sorts of issues and charting the way to our city's growth and recovery has been a focus of the clubs since our founding in 1912. That first year, we heard from the reform-minded mayor of Toledo, Brand Whitlock, and we also hosted a debate on the future of public transportation, streetcars or subways. And listen to this. In 1986, with our friends at Cleveland State University, we launched a series called Advancing Cleveland. It was memorialized in this book.
From the shtetl with nothing. They came to New York. Now, they didn't all find riches, far from it in many cases. But over a generation, everyone went to college, everybody ended up owning a house. There was great progress. In other words, New York was a transformative experience. And I think we've sort of forgotten that that's the role cities are supposed to play. They're supposed to be places where people come to improve their lives and the lives of their family. Now we talk about cities almost in a negative sense. Well, if they're in the cities, they won't be in the suburbs, or if they're in the cities, they won't be wasting energy, or they won't be having children, or they will do all these. They won't do any of these antisocial acts. But the fact is, we've forgotten that what cities are for. We think of them as lifestyle centers. We see them from aesthetic point of view, but we don't really think about them very much as engines of opportunity for people. And that's really what the history of cities is about, and I think that's what we need to focus on. So what's going to grow the economy? Because fundamentally, Richie's talked a lot about the demographic changes, but what really drives demographic change and why demographic change is important is if it translates into something that has an economic effect. In other words, you can go to Portland and you can, it's a great place for young people to retire. But it really, but on the other hand, you can get migration into an area which is will do a great deal to, let's say, energize your medical industry or your manufacturing industry or your logistics industry or your housing industry. All those things need to be connected. So what are the real drivers, I think, for this part of the country in particular, and for other parts as well, but I think this is particularly for this part of the country. One, the existing strengths in the real economy. Manufacturing will never come back with the number of jobs or the kind of jobs it did, but it is still an embedded skill. There's a lot of skill that should not be thrown out. As we all know, when we get older, our parents amazingly seem to get smarter. And I think that one of the things that we forget about is that these embedded skills that you have here are translatable into other industries and are still important, still part of a core competency. Technology really follows this point. We've been looking very closely at technology growth. And it turns out that technology growth in Cleveland and nationwide is very different than Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has a specific kind of technological growth, search engines, things like that. 40% of all the growth in the country in that area is in Silicon Valley. But where there's more rapid growth is in the embeddedness of technology into other industries, including medical, including engineering, including logistics. And that really is going to be much more the future of technology. And by the way, that's where the vast majority of the new STEM jobs are happening nationwide. Housing affordability. It's maybe difficult for you living here to understand what a severe issue this has become. It's become, by the way, the constraint for Silicon Valley. Even amidst all the money that's being spent there, population growth is actually rather slow, because literally it is a gated community. You can't afford to live there unless you're young and you're willing to live in a place with 4 other people, or if you have wealthy parents, or maybe you got involved with an IPO. But fundamentally, and I'll show you some of the numbers that we have on affordability, for the next generation, moving to the Bay Area, buying a house, raising a family is almost out of the question. I mean, we're literally at that stage right now. That's why we increasingly talk about large parts of California as being the geriatric coast, because only old people with money can afford to buy. So, like, we're even seeing that money, the people who we were looking at who were buying houses, a lot of them weren't young couples. They were older people who were moving for some other reason, but had the capital from a previous house to buy. So this affordability issue is probably the most critical issue of all, particularly for the next generation, particularly as middle and working class people try to have what previous generations achieved. And then there are some shifts in demographics, particularly among younger people, that I think are going to be very important. And then also, obviously, with immigration as well. So first of all, let's just take a quick snapshot at where the Great Lakes are. As you can see, the Great Lakes has gone through a period, a very precipitous drop in its percentage of the nation's jobs, but starting really about 2008, 2009, sort of flattened out. In other words, you may have now gotten to a point that you're sort of at least stabilizing your share of the nation's jobs, which I think is pretty significant, particularly given the fact that this was a very rough recession for many core industries in this part of the country. And as we project the various parts of America, this is from a firm that we work with called MC out of Idaho. The Great Lakes will remain the largest economic force in the United States for the foreseeable future. Basically, you have an economy basically about the size of France is the economy of the Great Lakes. And, I can't say the food is as good, but the people are more pleasant. Having married a girl whose mother's from Paris, I can attest. Okay. Okay. Now, let's start with this. There's this notion that the real economy doesn't matter. That it's all, how many times can you repackage advertising dollars, which is unfortunately what Silicon Valley is doing most of the time now. I think it does make a big difference. If we look over what's happened the last 10 years, it's made an enormous difference, and it will make more of a difference over time. One thing the United States has in general is we have a lot of land, and that is going to become a more and more critical advantage over time as populations grow and as people in the developing world begin to move up and begin to want to consume higher-end agricultural products. Here's something that I thought was interesting. Fresh water. If you've spent time in China, probably the single biggest constraint facing China is water, and their water supplies are in terrible shape. They're very polluted, they're very limited, and you're sitting right here on about 1/5 of the world's fresh water. So over time, if I was to figure out what industries I would be looking at, one of the things I would do is what industries really need water. And I can tell you that plays a very big role long-term in where growth is going to take place. We're going to see in California, for lots of reasons, not of all of which are natural, we're going to see our growth greatly constrained by lack of water. If nothing else, any industry that uses water is not going to come in, and it's going to be yet another very high cost factor. The big change that's taken place in Ohio is right in the middle of this, is the shift to natural gas in the United States. Now, natural gas obviously makes all sorts of sense in terms of having a much lower carbon content than oil and coal, particularly with coal. And this is going to be a major driver because it brings us with the capacity to do things at a much lower cost than our competitors in China or in Europe. And what's interesting about the current energy boom and the energy boom that went on, particularly in the last 5-6 years, is where it's distributed. And of course, it's very much distributed here in the area around Ohio, parts of the Midwest. People forget that the oil industry got its start in Pittsburgh and in the areas of this part of the country. But this is extremely important because it means that you have a cheap, reliable source of energy for industry over time. So the energy industry right now obviously is going through a difficult period, but we have to understand it in sort of two dimensions. Right now, because I do a lot of work in Houston, they're seeing reductions in the exploration part, but the production part, in other words, taking the feedstock from the oil and using it for other purposes, that's going to grow. So it's very good news for industry that gas and oil prices have dropped. And this will also allow for the reindustrialization of a large part of the United States. This is something that was completely unexpected. Remember when Kunstler and others were writing, peak oil, we're all going to run out of oil. You know, that was sort of like Ehrlich saying that we were going to run out of food. I mean, it's amazing how people can keep predicting the wrong things and still people listen to them. But the fact of the matter is this energy situation with the huge supplies is enormously useful for this part of the country in particular, and for the really evolving industrial revival that's really going from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf Coast, which I think is the big growth corridor in the next 20 years. Manufacturing is easy. People like to knock it. Actually, the United States has held its ground in manufacturing pretty well. The big decline has been Europe and Japan, and the increase, obviously, in China. This is very important for this part of the country. You can see about 18% of Ohio's gross state product is in manufacturing, 14% in Pennsylvania, 25% in Indiana, 20% in Wisconsin. It's 10% in California, 13% in Texas. And states like New York have almost completely deindustrialized, which is what you have in terms of a class perspective, is you have a wealthy, service-based economy in the suburbs and in the city of New York, and upstate New York, which has got poverty rate very close to Appalachia. They literally have allowed the entire economy to deindustrialize. You really don't want to do that if you can avoid it. So I think the manufacturing still got to be part of the picture for this part of the country. And you can see since between 2009 and 2013, Ohio gained almost 52,000 manufacturing jobs. Now, obviously, if you went back further, you'd still be well behind. But there has been some potential. And what's interesting about manufacturing today is it's increasingly technology intensive. And the type of jobs, I was down in Licking County, and I went to several of the training centers, and they're training people, including some from Cleveland, in various industrial arts that actually pay better, plumbers, people like that, plumbers, machinists, all those kinds of jobs, which actually pay better than going to college and wasting your time. But anyway, we won't say that, will we? Okay. And of course, manufacturing has a high multiplier, lots of procurement, lots of things that go on, marketing. So actually, manufacturing still is very important, and I think it's it's part of the arsenal that you want to use as you move forward. A lot of it has to do also with manufacturing. Manufacturing is about half of all the R&D jobs in the United States. So if you have a lot of manufacturing, you're going to have quite a few R&D jobs. Again, over time, more and more of the jobs in manufacturing will be like tech jobs. They'll need a skill. They won't be repetitive tasks. So when you look at manufacturing employment overall, even over the long term, traditional assembly kind work has been declining, but the more technologically advanced parts, the marketing, the research, that's all gone up considerably. And one of the really helpful things to look at is where are people putting new plants. And I would argue it's a combination of embedded skills, relatively good business climate. I think those two things, affordability, that drives people to these places, and the growth of natural gas and cheap and reliable energy is a big part of it. So you look at where have the new plants been in the U.S., number one is Texas, number two is Ohio, number three is Louisiana. So there's something very, very positive happening in Ohio that no one would have talked about 10 years ago. And part of it is the tremendous amount of engineering skill. The engineering jobs, the Great Lakes has the largest concentration of engineering jobs in the United States. Lots of the leading colleges for engineering are in this part of the country. And that's part of your legacy, because you were a manufacturing area, you needed engineering, and that continued to grow over the years. And even though much of that engineering will be probably deployed elsewhere, it is a great asset for this region in the years ahead. I think we are going to move into a very different era in technology over the next 5 to 10 years. And there's this, everything that you hear now in Silicon Valley is the era of the apps, and Richie described it as where you can get your underwear delivered online. there's only so much you can go on that. A lot of those companies are very, very overvalued, and fundamentally they're just not, they're not creating much in the way of productive growth. What I think the next stage is taking this technology and applying it to what they call the Internet of Things. And that's an area where Cleveland and the middle part of the country, it may be in very good shape. And this really is a different understanding of technology. To me, somebody who's developing a medical instrument or way of electronic way of measuring health is doing something that's certainly more technologically important than Facebook, okay? And the French sociologist Marcel Mauss used the term of technology as a traditional action made effective. In other words, we need certain things in life, and we use technology to apply it, whether it's medical or food or energy, and that really is where the future of the technological revolution is going to go. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how it varies from different parts of the country. First of all, the big growth is all in what we would look at as embedded industry: computer systems design, programming services, engineering services. Those are basically embedded in existing industries or new industries, new companies in existing industries. The internet publishing, broadcasting, and the web, that's web search, 122,000 jobs compared to the other ones, which you can see are considerably higher. That's really what you would call Google, Apple. Most of what they're doing would be embedded in that sector. So if you can see where the increase has been very dramatic in that sector, but that is a very concentrated sector. Remember, 122,000 jobs. In the Bay Area, it's had much more rapid growth, and it's about 47,000 jobs. So about 50,000 of 122,000 jobs in what is discussed in the media as tech are in the Bay Area. I mean, that's why fundamentally the Facebooks and the Googles don't have a huge footprint in the rest of the country. They have very publicized places, but they really are not the big job creators. The big job creators in a place like, particularly a place like Cleveland, are in these embedded industries. So as you can take a look, here, internet publishing and broadcasting web, 17% growth. Other computer-related services, custom computer services, much, much more rapid growth. So fundamentally, tech is not leaving Cleveland. It's been here all along. It's being deployed differently. And that's what's really important, because unfortunately, when the media covers tech, they put their tech reporter is basically in San Francisco, maybe he's in New York. And of course, they're going to report about the industries that are hot there. Something great developed here in Cleveland might as well not exist as far as the tech reporters are about. So we tried to figure out where the jobs were in Cleveland, where the growth was, and it was an almost opposite picture of what you see in Silicon Valley. Now, the other factor besides the technological and the industrial is the demographic, and I think the demographic may be the most important. What we're seeing is a secular movement of people to smaller towns and cities. In other words, in some cases, more rural places, but a lot to cities that have less population. The search for affordability, that is probably the key thing, and I'll get back into that. And the fact that you can now work in different places because of the internet. You don't necessarily need to have to get access to certain kinds of communications or technology to live in a very limited number of places. So first we take a look at what we see from 2000 to 2012. The domestic migration in the cities over 10 million, the metros over 10 million, was negative 11%. The big growth seems to be in the cities, 1 million, 2.5 million. That seems to be the sweet spot where people are moving. Some of this is tied to affordability issues, but a lot of it is that you no longer need to be in New York or Chicago to do certain things. And that also includes amenities. the amenity structure in smaller cities is much, much better than it was 20, 30 years ago. Restaurants are better, theaters better, the places to walk are better. So there's a lot of change going on in urbanism that's really not taking place in the very large cities. And the key thing is housing affordability. Now I'm just going to explain a little bit about what happened historically. The median multiple is the median house price divided by median household income, okay? Now, historically, it was always 3. In other words, San Francisco had higher housing prices, but it had higher salaries. That pattern has been broken since the 70s and 80s. A lot of the reason for the extreme inequality that we see in parts of the country is because the price of housing has jumped so much faster than salaries. In the last couple of years in LA, our housing prices have grown 10 times faster than incomes. Well, this creates all sorts of problems, particularly for young families and obviously for the poor, because when housing prices go up, rents go up as well. So if you take a look, San Francisco is at 9, it's going to be at 10 very soon. That means that if you make $100,000 in San Francisco, a family income of $100,000 would mean that you would have to have about $1 million house is what you would be looking for. We just looked for a house in Southern California, moving from LA down to Orange County. You cannot get anything in a good school district if you have a family of 4 for much less than $1 million. Well, you can imagine that a lot of people can't get into that market. So what we see is enormous differences in where people can move, where they can afford to move, and it's particularly important for young families. Young people have been the group that have had the hardest time getting into the home market, and there are certain parts of the country it's almost impossible to do so. Now, what that does is it drives migration, and what we do is we take a look at where people migrate relative to housing prices. And again, if housing prices, you go 6, 7 times median multiple, you're way over what most people can afford, and people leave. So when we look at migration, it's very important to understand also that there's an age component to that. As people get older, they move into that phase of life when they want to buy a house, start a family, and all of a sudden places like Cleveland become much more attractive. Same thing with having children. Basically, about 90% of all married families with children live in single-family houses. Well, you can't remotely afford to do that in the Bay Area. Got to remember, the vast majority of the Bay Area is very suburban, particularly San Jose. But right now, with housing prices at 9 to 10 multiple, it's very, very difficult for anyone to move in there. And so your ability to attract people is greatly limited. It's one of the reasons why Zuckerberg and all those guys are trying to get the H-1B visas, because this way they get what my Indian friends call techno coolies. They can get people to come from India who don't mind living in a little apartment for 5 years, because they'll go back to India and they'll live better than they ever imagined they could. Very difficult to get a conventional American family to do that. So this is part of what's driving migration. We were talking with Jim Russell earlier about the finance industry. Even though the financial sector has done very well in New York, they've actually been losing jobs because people can't afford middle management jobs, and even upper middle management jobs are going elsewhere. So the largest office in North America outside of New York for Goldman Sachs is now in Salt Lake City. I mean, and what they're finding is that at first it was to service foreign accounts because all the missionaries, you want to find somebody who speaks Lithuanian, you got to go to Salt Lake City. But what's interesting is in what they're finding is now more senior people are saying, no, I want to transfer to Salt Lake City because I can buy a house, and a really nice house, and go skiing and do all these things that I couldn't possibly afford to do in New York. I mean, a friend of mine just sold his mom's apartment at it was $5,000 per square foot. $5,000 per. And of course, Hillary Clinton's husband had his starter apartment for $5 million. I don't know. I guess that's, she's one of the people, I guess. But anyway, I mean, the fact of the matter is that you can't, when you have that kind of entry point, it very limits who can go into a place. And where, to go back to Descartes, this is a place of possibility. Somebody can come here from a small town, from a foreign country, and get into the system, buy a house, raise a family, without having to put all their money into their housing. And to give you an illustration of how this works in the real world, this is something that I think will make a big difference in the work that Richie and others are doing here, is we took the average salary of a biomedical engineer, pretty high-end person, about $100,000 a year. To qualify for a median price house in Orange County is $117,000. So literally, even a well-educated person cannot afford to buy a house in Orange County. As you can see, in Orange County, obviously, all sorts of people can't get housing. So what you have is people being forced to make the choice. I've done many interviews in New York, in California about this, where people say, I really want to stay where I am, but I can't possibly make that next move up. And so people make this decision not to have kids, not to buy a house, not to move into the space they want because they want to stay in the particular city. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're being that productive. It just means they're being made to make choices that historically people didn't have to make in this country. And one of the first effects we see is the 25 to 34 BAs. And Jim and Richie have done a lot of work on this. This is what our numbers showed from 2010 to 2012. And you can see where they're going. Nashville, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Orlando, Jacksonville, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. In other words, people are moving to places with educations. They're moving to the places they think they can afford. And a lot of it's trajectory. If you move to Houston, you can live in the inner ring of Houston. You could buy a nice place. And then when you get older, you can buy a place in the suburbs. The big problem for a place like the Bay Area is the suburbs are also incredibly expensive. So if you want to buy a house in Cupertino, which is where Apple is, you what, 1,800 square foot house built in 1960, probably about $2 million, which is why over 50% of the workforce there is Asian, because they're people, because if you're coming from Shanghai, it's cheap. So this is changing everything. So over the years, as housing price differentials between regions grow, in those economies that are decent, you're going to start to see the movement of population. So, it's so funny, whenever you read the New York Times, you get, wow, all the 25 to 34-year-olds, they all are, hanging out in hipster bars in Brooklyn. Well, apparently not. And actually, the most recent analysis we have is the percentage of millennials in San Francisco, Portland, and New York has been dropping for the last 5-6 years. And the perfectly good reason. Can't afford to be there. A friend of mine sells real estate in Brooklyn, and she says every single person under the age of 40 that she sold a home or apartment to, the parents have paid. I mean, and I have to say, very often I speak around the country, the richest guy in the room has a kid living in Brooklyn or San Francisco. Nobody else does, but they do. Because I find it funny, because I grew up in Brooklyn, so it seems like, well, it's kind of strange. Also, just so you know about Brooklyn, because my mother's from a place called Brownsville, which is, I won't use her language exactly, but it was a crummy neighborhood then, and there's a crummy neighborhood now. About 25% of the population of Brooklyn is on food stamps. So even how we portray what's going on is wildly off, because the reporters don't go to the other parts of Brooklyn. There are huge parts of Brooklyn that aren't doing so well. But the bottom line is those parts that are attractive have become prohibitively expensive. A friend of mine bought a house in a place called Ditmas Park, which is near Prospect Park, for $250,000 20 years ago. He says he can get about $2.2 million. Well, obviously the buyer of $220,000 property as opposed to the buyer of a $2 million property. So what you get in places like New York and London is a guy in the FT, Financial Times, wrote about it. He said, this is places where the 1% reproduce themselves. Because they're the only ones who can afford to get in there. That's a very different situation than even New York 20 years ago. So, now, I want to go a little into some of what I call the canaries in the coal mine. Immigrants, young families, millennials. Now, first of all, what do people want? The vast majority of people want a single-family house. That doesn't mean there isn't a market, and that market's been amazingly stable for the last 40 years. About 10 to 15% want dense urban. That's about, and we were probably underproducing that. I think we probably are about to overproduce it. But the majority of people want to live in single-family houses. And there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, they grew up in single-family houses. If they want to have a family. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do that in the city. Most American cities are predominantly single-family houses. But this is an important thing. It just seems to me amazing that we have an entire movement in this country in urban planning which is determined to wipe out how people actually want to live. The best analogy is a wonderful article in New Geography from my best student, who's originally from Slovakia, and she wrote a wonderful piece about communist ideas of city planning. And boy, I can tell you, they sounded awfully familiar. They didn't like single-family homes because they didn't like the fact that people would spend their time with their families and not socially. They didn't want kids to play in the backyard because they wouldn't be socialized correctly. Okay, it sounds familiar to me. The bottom line is we have different geographies. H.G. Wells, 100 years ago, wrote about this in London, that there would be this inner core which would become ever more attractive, predominantly with people without children. He called it elegant extinction. And Wells then said there would be this other geography, which would be the home geography, where families were, where kids were raised. Herbert Gans wrote about the same things about New York about the 1960s. These patterns are there. We need both of those geographies. What bothers me is when people say, well, no, we can't have suburbs, we can't have single-family homes, everyone has to live the way we think they should live. Well, I don't think that's a winning agenda for anybody, except for people who would benefit from limiting the competition. Now, let's talk about millennials, because so much crap, I have to say the word, is out there. Millennials want this, as if millennials are some weird species that were developed in a test tube at the MIT lab or something. Like they're not human beings. They don't like their comfort. You know, people say, well, they don't want to live in single-family homes. They want to live in dense apartments, and they don't mind 3 or 4 people living in the same place. Well, I don't know. I remember being in my 20s, and I have to say, it didn't really matter, where I lived. I mean, I didn't know where I was going to end up anyway that night. And, all I can tell you, Los Angeles in the early 70s was great fun. But you grow up. At some point, you can't, going to the jazz club and going home at 3 in the morning when you're 45 years old, it doesn't feel so good. And you don't feel good for a while. Anyway, millennials are human beings, and they are going to evolve somewhat the way we have. There are going to be some differences, but this is a big point. 13 million households headed by millennials in 2013, 21.6 million by 2018. What's happening to the millennials is what happens to kids, if any of you happen to have ever had them. They grow up. Sometimes it's not so good. Sometimes it's great. But the fact is that the millennial generation, which we usually say about 2002 to about, some people take it up to about 2008, that group is getting older. And as they get older, they're going to care much more about cost of living, economic opportunity, than when you're 19 years old and, okay, being a barista in San Francisco is great. You want to be a barista in San Francisco when you're 45? Maybe not. Then they say, well, they don't want space. There's always these places in pieces on Yahoo every time. Oh, the mini house, the house 100 square feet, 200 square feet. And of course, I always wanted to ask Marissa Mayer. I said, well, you know, you built right next to your office a nursery that's bigger than these houses, and yet they think it's great that people want this. So the Demand Institute, which is Nielsen, asked the question, what do you want? Do you want more space, less space? About 61% wanted more space. You know, it's just natural. And I think as we evolve our economy, and this is in the new book I'm working on, more and more people are going to want space at home because more and more people will be working at home. And the numbers are pretty overwhelming. So what you're going to see, if not full-time, part-time, and those people are going to want space either close to home or in their home. But the bottom line is people have different expectations. When my grandparents came from Russia, they didn't know anything. And they just had babies in these tiny apartments in Brooklyn. The next generation, nobody had that many kids, and they had much more space. In other words, the space requirements of families today, and by the way, this is true, and I taught in Singapore, same thing. People do not want to be in this tight space as our grandparents were. Now, there are some in the new urbanist movement who would like to go back to the experience of living in tenements, but I think most of us should reject that option. Home ownership. Oh, no, millennials aren't interested in homes. They don't want to buy a home. Because after all, one of the big reasons to move to Cleveland is I can buy a house. I can get a good quality of life, whether it's in an urban neighborhood or in the suburbs. I've got these options. Well, it turns out that 60% are planning to purchase, 24% already own, and only 16% will not purchase. So when we do the numbers, what we find out is survey-wise, older married millennials are more likely to value home ownership than baby boomers. So a lot of what you're hearing, you know, what I think happens is you get somebody who's got a theory that they want to push. They go out and they interview people who will fit that theory, and they don't bother looking at the numbers. I mean, that's the thing I always try. First thing, whenever I'm asking, I would go to a demographer and say, what do the numbers tell us? And that's why I thought the work that Richie and Jim are doing is so important for Cleveland to understand even what it is itself, where it's going, what its advantages are. You only can do that by researching it. And I thought this is something very important to Cleveland, long-term, millennials having to make the choice. Where can I live where I can afford a house? My road to Damascus moment was when I was doing a project in St. Louis. I interviewed a bunch of postdocs at Washington University, and you think, this is the creme de la creme. Everybody would want these people. So I said, and I have particular techniques of interviewing. I said, why are you living in this piece of crap town when you can live in Boston or you can live in San Diego? And the great response I'll never forget is all of them said at the same time, I could never afford to buy a house there. If you know at age 35 that buying a house in San Diego is not in the cards, it changes how it is. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want to go to San Diego for a vacation, or, if you get really wealthy, you could move to San Diego, but very different psychology. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that this is some new data. The generation of millennials by 2016, there'll be more over 28 than under 28, and you can see where the trajectory is, because obviously, except for me, everybody goes forward in age, not back. So the bottom line is the millennial generation in 10 years is going to look very different than the millennial generation does today, which already looks different than they did a few years ago.
Do you want to get to questions soon?
Yes, I'm going to go. Millennials, most of them actually want to have families that will drive it. Very foreign-born, that's been an area, and I know Jim and Richie have looked at it. That's got to be a big focus for you, because I think this is a place that would be very attractive to immigrants if you could figure out how to build yourself into that media. As you can see, in a share of new households, look at owners. The foreign-born are about 40% nationwide. So I think they're looking for things. We've seen in the last 10, 15 years, to show you what affordability and an economy means. Houston is now second in the United States in the growth of foreign-born. It has more. It has 3 times the growth in foreign-born as L.A. County, which had the highest population of the foreign-born. So they're going to move. They're very important entrepreneurially. They're one of the few groups who are starting more small businesses, and they mostly like houses. About 8 of the 20 most Asian cities in America, 18 are suburbs. So just to conclude, just to leave a few thoughts about what all this means. First of all, Shakespeare's right about most things. That the important thing is you got to start out with a strategy that makes sense for Cleveland. That's why the numbers are so important. The numbers, and then getting a sense of, when you interview people, why they do what they do. Now, I had great fun with Jennifer Granholm, who I consider to be one of the great buffoons of modern America. She had this whole, remember Cool Kalamazoo and Cool Flint? Really worked well. And the Michigan talk show host said to me, if you need a campaign to prove you're hip and cool, you're not. And I think that's something for Cleveland to think about. Don't worry about what the New York Times says about, oh, Cleveland's got these 3 great restaurants. Think about, you build your economy, there'll be plenty of restaurants. There'll be plenty of demand for nice apartments. Of all the places I've seen, the most dramatic transformation of the downtown is Fargo, North Dakota. 20 years ago, it was as gruesome as you could get. With the growth of Great Plains Software, with a whole bunch of other startup companies, they've got a great downtown. They've got such a great downtown with all these very elegant-looking Scandinavian people. I was trying to convince a friend of mine in Hollywood, let's do Housewives of North Dakota. He didn't buy it. I don't know why, but anyway. So it's important to understand that the hip, cool stuff is generic. What you want is Cleveland is a great place to live, a great place to have a job, great place to raise a family, great place to buy a house. Don't worry, the restaurants will follow. And then, if you get some immigrants, you might even have some good food. So that's also very, very important over time. Cleveland has to, wage its campaign on its own terms. So just the focus at the end, the industrial legacy, building off that legacy, building off technological diffusion. Incredibly important fact that your housing costs on a median multiple basis are 1/3 what they are on the coast. That's an enormous advantage, become more of an advantage over time. And again, for the 2 key food groups you want, millennials, particularly educated millennials, and immigrants. You've made the case with millennials. That's starting to happen. Hopefully you'll find a way to make the case to immigrants. If immigrants can find their way to Houston, they can find their way to Cleveland. Thank you very much.
Great job. All right, I'm going to rush through this transition to the Q&A, but I'm going to suggest that possibly we go a couple minutes long so that we can fit in more questions. 5 minutes long, I've been told. Okay, great. So I'm Dan Moulthrop again. We're enjoying a forum featuring Joel Kotkin here at the City Club of Cleveland. We're going to get into the Q&A in a moment. If you're joining us via our live stream at cityclub.org, please tweet your questions with the hashtag CityClub. And be sure to tune into our Friday forums on 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream. That's our primary media partner, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts and radio broadcasts are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Please join us this Friday, tickets still available, April 24th, as we welcome Martha Bergmark, Founding Executive Director at Voices for Civil Justice. We'll have a conversation on American civil legal aid and the unmet promise of justice for all. You can find out more about that and all of our upcoming and past programs at cityclub.org. We welcome guests at tables hosted today by Cleveland City Council, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, Cleveland State University, Forest City, and Team NEO. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We also welcome students from West Geauga High School. Hello, West G. Thank you for being here. Student participation is made possible by a generous grant from the Mary Jane Spar and Charles E. Spar Charitable Trust. And now let's get to the Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests holding our microphones today, our content associate, Teddy Eisenberg, and our director of programming, Stephanie Jansky. Let's get the first question.
the end. Could you go into a little bit more about the advantages of bringing immigrants here?
Okay, sure. There are lots of different advantages to immigrants. One thing is immigrants, my experience has been, and I think there's pretty good research, tend to work harder, work longer, willing to do jobs that other people aren't willing to do. That's on one area. And the other area I think very important on immigrants is that they also bring different skill sets. I mean, if you go right now in Silicon Valley, about 50% of the employees in Silicon Valley in tech are foreign born. So that's a pretty big area. If you go into the entertainment industry now, huge amount of people from a lot from India and from the UK in particular. So I think that they bring in new elements. It's almost like if you think of it in biological terms, that hybrid species tend to be stronger. And in a way, an economy that brings in these different elements are going to generally do better. If you look at it historically, the cities that attracted immigrants and integrated them were all the great cities of the world. Nobody's been able to develop a great city that didn't rely predominantly on immigrants, either from the countryside or from other countries. And one very important point in all the work that I'm doing around the world on cities is the countryside is emptying out all over the world. It's emptied out quite a bit in the United States already. And so cities are going to have to get their new population from other places in the world because there won't be all those small town kids to move in because that population is declining pretty rapidly.
Mr. Kotkin, the title of your talk includes how the Rust Belt can come back, so I'll welcome you instead of the freshwater coast.
Okay.
Other people may have given us Rust Belt, but we'll take freshwater.
I'll take all the fresh water you have.
We hope many more of you will come. But I was curious in your slides, I thought I saw that there was an actual decline in the biotech jobs in this area, which kind of surprises me because we hear a lot about a lot of venture capital being invested in a lot of biotech and health concerns around here that are engines. Is that a change or is that just something temporary? What do you see happening?
It's probably something temporary. Plus, remember, we're only adding the STEM, we're only looking at the STEM jobs within medical. So other medical jobs wouldn't be counted in that. You know, I'll have to say that, you know, a lot of work has to be done beyond what we've done or what Jim and Richie are doing in understanding this diffusion. This is what makes it so complicated because so many jobs that are tech jobs are in industries that are not tech, and yet we don't always get the clearest job description of how much technology they use. Personally, I think in 10 years we're not even going to bother with this because every job will have enough tech in it that it really will no longer matter. I mean, we look like an entertainment industry now, which I've been involved for a long time. The entertainment industry is really very heavily becoming technological. You know, my neighbors are cutting movies in their basements or in their spare rooms. They're not technical workers, but they're using technology. So but I would like to tease that out a little bit more. But I know the biotech sector has been growing in general, but it could be one layoff in one company that could distort that over a short period of time.
Maybe could you speak to I'm right here.
Oh, okay.
The enormous debt that millennials
Yes.
they have now as it relates to college, and I think that's making choices difficult on the housing front as well. So maybe you could speak to that, and then where do you see education in the future as it relates to young people looking for the next step?
Okay. The question, first of all, that's a good thing to recognize. One of the reasons millennials are having a hard time getting into the housing market is a lot of them are coming in with a lot of college debt. And that's going to mean that they're never going to have the money to buy a house in New York or California. So, because if they're eventually going to buy a house, where are they going to get the down payment? You know, I was trying to buy a house in coastal Southern California in a good school district. $1 million. You got 200 grand. How many kids have 200 grand when they're also paying off the loan? So I think that's a big problem. Now, education, now I guess maybe I'll make a few enemies with this. Four-year colleges are probably overdeveloped. We're developing, certainly putting people through with degrees that, as we used to say in New York, that in a subway token will get you a ride on the subway. I mean, I've never been to a business group where somebody said, God, if we could only get some more postmodernist English graduates, we would be in so much better shape. Is there interest in engineers? Are there interest in business majors? Nothing wrong with getting an education, but not to expect that that's going to lead to a job. And I think a lot of young people would be much better off learning a specific skill, how to do something. I found when I was working in Louisiana that there were LSU English graduates learning how to become process engineers in the community colleges after graduating LSU. I mean, because fundamentally there just are not going to be enough jobs for the liberal arts majors that we're producing. And by the way, we're not unique in this. Every country in the world is running into the same problem. There just aren't enough of certain things, and there are too many of other things. And the education system has simply not adjusted to it. I mean, that's really, my older daughter is a special needs kid, and so she said, well, what should I do? And I said, you know what? Learn how to take care of elderly people or severely disabled. She's very good at that. I could put her through the University of Arizona for 4 years with special help and all that. What's the point of that? She would come out with a degree that would mean nothing. But if she got a certificate in working with the elderly, she can work for the rest of her life. And so I think we have to sort of change where schools are. Now, what's really interesting is you go into the history of land-grant colleges in America. That was what they were there for. They were there to train people for the skills that were needed. Somewhere along the line, the universities went off into their own galaxy and completely lost touch with the economy that they're around. I'll give you one quick illustration. I worked in a town called Salinas. I don't know if you ever heard of Salinas, California. John Steinbeck, right? Grapes of Wrath, East of Eden. That East of Eden, by the way, is Salinas. And it's a farming town, predominantly Latino. And the local community college had one of the best agricultural technology classes. So you learn how irrigation systems work, learn about marketing, learn about processing, very practical skills, jobs right there. The university decided to get rid of the ag tech program so they could push these kids into the 4-year program at the state universities. Total disaster. It took us 2 years to reverse that. So education's got to get real about what the market really is and what the return is for these kids today. Now, for some, education's going to be great. 4 years, 6 years, 8 years might be great. But for a lot of kids, a certificate in a needed skill is much more valuable.
Hello, I found your housing research very interesting. My question for you is, what about looking at renting as an option? And there's some recent research to suggest that people are reevaluating the balance in the family household income and renting.
Well, the research on renting is very interesting, very different than what you read. And I now have about 7 or 8 different surveys. People still want to own. I mean, fundamentally, I guess in my religion has always been against renting, because why should I give somebody else my money for where I live? I think renting is a stage that people go through, and some people never get out of it. But I can tell you the biggest driver of inequality in the United States is the difference between those people who own and those who don't. I mean, it's just, and by the way, same thing's true in Europe. Piketty just came out with, there was a study on Piketty's research in France, and what they came up with the real difference was housing. So I think people want to own. I think they may own a different product than they did before. And renting is certainly an option that younger people, I think younger people will rent longer because the average age of buying a house is now older. And again, that's where I think the Cleveland difference may become more important. As millennials get into their mid-30s, and they've been paying rent for 15 years or 10 years, saying, if I could have taken that rent check and put it into a house, I'd own a house already. And I think that that's going to improve things. But I do think that that the desire to own is pretty powerful. I mean, the data was, and from 5 or 6 different sources, showed that that's, so this whole, now they say, well, look, more people are renting. Yeah, they're renting because they can't afford to buy. They're not renting because they want to rent. I mean, there is a group that does, but there's been no discernible change in the poll data about whether you would like to own a house. That's pretty overwhelming still. Yeah. Oh.
Over here. What does your research, what do the numbers, not the politicians, but what do the numbers tell you about the role that taxation plays in migration?
Okay. I think taxation plays a role. I don't think it plays as big a role as many conservatives believe. I think the question is, what do you get for your taxes? Like, for instance, okay, like we're moving down to Orange County. It's going to pay California taxes, but at least the roads are paved, and the water system isn't falling apart, and I can send my youngest daughter to a public school. I'll live with those taxes. But if you're paying a lot of taxes and you're not getting anything, that hurts. It also has an impact on employers, depending on what type of taxes they're paying. But our experience in working in California, both after the riots and also more recently, is it's the regulatory environment much more than the taxes, that at least for business. In other words, it's like I've spoken to a lot of real estate groups. And the inevitable thing is, yeah, we tried to build something in California. It took 25 years to get approval. I'm not going to do it again. In other words, if you're a business and you want to build a tower in Houston, it's fairly straightforward. You have to meet certain codes, and that's it. In California, you can. Valencia has been, which is a great community, and with lots of jobs, everything that you think they would want. 25 years they've been trying to expand Valencia, north of LA. 25 years. I've been involved in trying to develop a new city south of San Jose. They'll never do it. It would make all the sense in the world. You have terribly congested housing and high housing prices. The regulatory environment just won't let you do it. So I would say taxes are important, but regulation is even bigger. In my experience, I don't buy the argument that people move from Boston to Mississippi because of the taxes.
I know we didn't get to every question, but Joel's going to be sticking around, and you're invited to buy a book, have him sign it, and bend his ear at that moment as well. Thank you all for joining us today at the City Club. We've been enjoying a forum featuring Joel Kotkin. He's Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University, also the Executive Director at the Center for Opportunity Urbanism. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Our forum is now adjourned.